Hello, welcome to The Conversation on New Central Television. This is a program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. Today on The Conversation, we begin on the African continent, where the African Union has again reiterated its demand for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. This time, the AU is asking the new Chinese Foreign Minister, King Gang, who is currently on a week-long trip to Africa, to support the bloc's demands.
Well, it looks like Uganda's President, Yoweri Museveni, after 6 terms in office, is looking to preserve his family's dominance on the East African country as his first son, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, is beginning to position himself to succeed his father. But what are his chances in the country's next elections, which is set for 2026.
You know, these two topics are not necessarily new. Last year, I think, twice we dealt with the situation of a permanent seat for the African Union in the United Nations Security Council. And even for Uganda, this summer, we saw a series of tweets of which we had respectful people talking about it.
So he has that from, I mean, they've compared him to Trump, his Twitter fingers. And I'm also worried about why we're having this discussion. 2026 it's such a long time away, but I guess we'll get into the details during the course of the program.
Definitely, we will.
Now, Continental-wide intergovernmental organization, Afriyie Union, has called on China to support its call for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. This has come into the fore as newly appointed Chinese Foreign Minister King Gang is on a 1-week-long visit to Africa. This will be his first overseas trip as foreign minister, with designations points at Gabon, Angola, Benin and Egypt. The African Union has continued to lament the continent's lack of permanent representation on the United Nations Security Council, bearing in mind that most issues on the agenda are usually related to African countries.
Now, just last year, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and United States President Joe Biden, while addressing the UNGA during the high-level debate on September 21, called for the reformation of the United Nations Security Council to address historical inequality against Africa. The United Nations Security Council consists of 15 members, 5 permanent members with veto powers, and 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms by the General Assembly. And now join us for this conversation, we have Mawuli Dake, a Pan-Africanist and the CEO Africa Group Consult Ghana. We also have Achike Chude, a global affairs analyst, joining us from Lagos, Nigeria. Gentlemen, welcome to the conversation. All right, so thank you. So we have, for now, just Mr. Achike, and I'll begin with you. Now, the United Nations Security Council has 15 members. We have 5 permanent members with veto power, which is China, France, the Russian Federation, Britain, United States of America. Now, we have Africa, the African Union, calling for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Just for a background check, on what basis was Security Council permanent membership granted to these five countries? I don't want to use the word powerful, but yes, you're powerful. 5 countries.
Well, it was certainly not about equity. It was certainly not about, about justice. I think it was an expression of power, raw power. Of course, it became possible after the Second World War, when victorious powers decided that they were going to have more say on what happens in the global arena. And so they were the group of the countries that emerged victorious in the war. And so they decided to set the template of what was going to happen going forward. And so it was not as if they were elected. They were absolutely not, but they assumed the authority, on behalf of the rest of the world to be the ones to determine what would happen at the global stage. And of course, you know that the United Nations Security Council has binding powers on issues of war and peace. And so you can imagine the tremendous power that these 5 nations have, all over the world. And obviously, it is something, going into the modern world, today, where people talk about democracy, talk about equity, talk about representation, equitable representation, then you find out that the United Nations Security Council is an anomaly and an aberration. to issues of democracy. And of course, the leading members of the United Nations are said to be democratic countries, talking about the United States, France, and Britain. And so it becomes very difficult. I mean, it became very difficult as the decades went by for them to continue to talk about justice and equity when at the very highest level of the United Nations, that is the United Nations Security Council, there was no such word. There was nothing like democracy. There was nothing like equitable representation. So this is essentially why all of these discussions have been going on about the need to reform the United Nations, Security Council. I mean, to bring it in line with modern reality.
Now, Achike, following up on what you just said, the AU's chief, Musa Faki Mahamat, has insisted that the continent's lack of permanent representation at the United Nations Security Council was a cause of concern. Do you consider this true? And yes.
Yeah, obviously, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I think it was the former Minister of Internal Relations in South Africa, Maite Gbenga Aborowa, who first said, I think around 2005 or so, that about 70% of the discussions of the issues at the United Nations Security Council are about Africa. So you cannot talk about Africa. You cannot talk about, Africa and what happens in Africa, without African representation. That is the height of hypocrisy.
But it's not like, so it's important there, Achike. It's not like we don't have African representation there. It's just that they're not permanent members, because we have non-permanent seats that rotate, and we have some African countries that are represented there. So it's just the issue of
one of those discussions, had to do with Libya. One of those discussions had to do with Libya, and perhaps because Africa did not have a veto power, Libya was allowed to happen. And today, Libya is no man's land. It's a country that is rife with instability, with instability and the unrest.
Okay, I think we have Mawuli Dake on standby. He's our second guest on this topic. Let's just bring him in while we sort out Achike's connection. Hello, good evening to you, Mawuli, and thanks for joining us.
Good evening to you and to your listeners. Happy to join you from Accra this afternoon.
Akwaaba, we're happy to have you. Now, Mawuli, what do you make of this issue and this debate on Africa's lack of representation at the United Nations Security Council? What's your take on this?
Well, clearly, if there is one thing, I think there should be at least some level of consensus, not just within the African community, but globally, about the lack of representation, fairness, inclusiveness of the UN Security Council. A lot of work has been done, a lot of conversations have been had on this issue. And if we agree that the UN is a global institution, then it has to reflect that. Its governance structure has to reflect that global claim. If we say that the UN or the UN Security Council is a democratic institution, then it does have to reflect the principles that define democracy, which include inclusiveness, representation, fairness, which are clearly lacking in the current formation and structure of the UN Security Council. So in terms of, I don't even think it's a matter of debate right now as to whether the current formation and operations of the UN Security Council are anything that anybody can claim to be fair or representative or democratic.
Okay, now, Mawuli, I'll stay with you for a while, and this discussion is coming to the fore once again because of the fact that the AU chairperson, Musa Muhammad Faki, actually talked about the fact that he wanted China's support for the African Union as a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. Now, even though China is part of the five countries who have a permanent seat and who have veto powers, So asking China's support, would it actually make any difference?
Well, clearly, they said power concedes. Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without demand. It never has, it never will. So the seats that Africa so deserves on the council are definitely not just going to be handed over to Africa on a silver platter. We have to fight for it, we have to demand for it. But in doing so, I have some concerns about the approach, the begging and the approach that will surrender even that power to those that will hand it over to them. If somebody hands something over to you, it means they can easily take it away. So I think that we will use a more formidable approach, mobilizing African consensus and partners. Obviously, that would demand or require us to work with other partners, including the current members of the Security Council, who will be vital to the reforms that are needed. So naturally, in principle, I wouldn't have a problem with the African Union leadership seeking the support of China or any other permanent member of the Security Council. But obviously, the way and the approach only makes us susceptible to further manipulation and second-class status on the council. So yes, we have to do our own mobilization. We have to mobilize our own voices and demand this as a right, not as a favor from China or any other power.
Thank you. Now, Achike, back to you. In the 1970s, Fela had a song called Beasts of No Nation. In that song, he talked about the undemocratic nature of the United Nations. He said, what is really united about the United Nations, talking about East and West Bloc. You also, in your opening statement, did talk about the need to reform the United Nations. So is Africa going about this, its quest for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council the right way? Or, because if you look at the organization as a whole, the United Nations Security Council is very undemocratic. Should we not be pushing for reforms of the United Nations Security Council? Because if you put one or two African countries there, it won't make it any more democratic. So should that be our focus, or we just want to sit on the same table with the big boys? What do you make of this?
Yeah, well, Fela was obviously a prophet, and obviously again, there are issues at the level of, with the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, essentially because people have different objectives. People have different, countries have different global objectives. They have different, international objectives, and so they are always motivated by, first of all, national interest. It's not just the interest of the global village body, national interest, what is in need for them. That is what determines international politics, whether at the economic level, at the political level, whatever level, it's about national interest. And so that's why you have so much disparity, at the United Nations. You have different, countervailing forces, different, centrifugal forces pulling at different directions, because, all of these directions, are essentially the direction that represent the interests of the various members of the United Nations, Security Council. So whenever a decision has to be taken, what informs the position that countries take, remember, especially at the level of the United Nations Security Council, is based on the long-term objective of each of the nations that will be taking a decision. And let me just say this: the issue of permanent seat at the United Nations is something that would have been resolved a very long time ago. It's been on for about 2-3 decades, about 20, 30 years, and would have been resolved a long time ago. But the reason why it has not been resolved is that it's not just about getting permanent members into the security, members into the permanent seat of the United Nations Security Council. It is beyond that. I think the discussion has been about whether the members you're going to admit are also going to have veto powers. And so that has been the issue. And while some nations have actually agreed that, look, they can forfeit the issue of, having veto at the United Nations Security Council. But Africa has remained dogged and resilient. Africa has refused that the basis on which that they will be admitted to the United Nations Security Council must be on the fact that they would have access to veto power. And that's why it has delayed for so long, because those that are exercising veto power right now, the 5 permanent members, do not want to, are not considering other nations having veto power. So we also want to know the discussion that Africa is having with even the Chinese foreign minister.
Okay.
Is it about just permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, or is it about a permanent seat at the council with veto powers? So this is the issue, because you see, even if you admit people, countries or African countries at the United Nations Security Council, and you do not give them the veto power, then what is the difference, at that council with the rotational membership, of 2 years without veto power? So it is absolutely meaningless, and it means that it is simply going to be symbolic.
Okay, Achike, I'll stick with that fact of China, bringing China into this whole decision here. We have all the countries, part of the 5 big countries of the United Nations Security Council. Now, I want to look at the gesture, because earlier on, Mawuli talked about the approach that Africa is taking on securing a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. Now, while the new foreign minister, which was appointed in December, while he was had the inauguration at Addis Ababa, he did not actually talk about Africa's position in the United Nations Security Council, but rather they talked about forced relationship between China and Africa and putting Africa on a larger scale. So what do you have to say about China's relationship with Africa? It's been a long-standing relationship, talking about infrastructure and so many things that China has had with Africa. Is China actually going to push for Africa's permanent seat in the Security Council, or we just have the relationship between China and Africa? What exactly is your take on that?
Well, I don't think China has a choice. China does not have a choice. United Nations, or the United States also does not have a choice. Of course, that President Biden has said recently that they are going to support Africa's push for permanent membership of the United Nations. The reason why they don't have, any choice really, is simply because once more Africa has become the beautiful bride. Everybody wants Africa right now, not for the love of Africa, but for the love of Africa's resources, which they have continually, on a consistent basis, continue to exploit for their benefits, and leaving Africa with almost nothing. So Africa, I agree, has to speak with one voice. Africa has to have an idea of what it really wants and be in a position to also impose, certain conditions on the international, on some of these other countries, globally. Because it must come with a price. The support, that Africa, that they need from Africa must come with a price. And so we should be ready but again, and that's why there must be some level of consistency. And in fairness to Africa, we've had this level of consistency with regards to what happens at the United Nations, Security Council. In 2005, the Ezuwini, consensus insisted that Africa must be given 2 seats at the permanent, at the United Nations Security Council, as well as 5 other seats. But as at 2022, last year, when they had the meeting of the Committee of 10 in Uganda, they had cut it down to 2 permanent members of the United Nations from Africa, Security Council from Africa, and 2 non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So, like I said, everybody desires something from Africa. I think is what is key. What is at issue now is how Africa is able to articulate its own continental interest and use that as a basis, to make certain demands on members. On foreign powers that want to continue to take things out of the continent. We have what they do not have. We have natural resources. 65% of arable land global arable land is in Africa. In 25 years' time, and about 2050, the world's youthful population, 25% of the world's youthful population will come from Africa. Okay. So if we can get it right politically, Africa will rule the world.
Thank you, Achike. Now, Mawuli, this is a hypothetical question, but I guess with the way things are going, we might get an answer to this in the nearest future. So if a permanent seat is granted to Africa at the United Nations Security Council, what will be the determining factor for choosing which African country or countries occupy this position? Will it be Ghana, the country of the leading Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah? Will it be Nigeria because of its size and its standing on the continent? Or will it be South Africa, Africa's most industrialized economy? How do we determine what country deserves this position?
Well, I do have some views on that. And in fact,
be careful there, though. You know what country you're from.
Yes.
So just be careful. I'm just giving a hint.
Well, actually, my choice will surprise you. But it's actually been one of the key factors that has delayed this process. My first job after I graduated from law school was at the UN when this conversation was happening under Kofi Annan. And I admire the leadership that Nigeria, specifically under Obasanjo and your ambassador then played. But then the debate was for a permanent seat. And so there was a lot of contention between South Africa and Nigeria. If it were Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana, with a Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana today, I would definitely vote for Ghana. But under current circumstances, definitely not under, what's his name?
Nana Akufo-Addo.
Buhari, but with a stronger Nigerian leadership, I would definitely vote for Nigeria to be Africa's rep. If it is one seat, I would choose Nigeria any day over South Africa.
What are your reasons?
Different geopolitical reasons.
What are your reasons?
Well, because I think that Nigeria has demonstrated greater leadership. As I said, I was working at the UN when this conversation started, when Kofi Annan was the UN Secretary General. And I saw greater leadership from Nigeria. Plus, Nigeria has provided greater Pan-African leadership compared to South Africa. I think that South Africa is more susceptible to compromising Africa's interest. So I will be more comfortable with Nigeria, considering your population, your economic power, your location, your representation, and your relationship with other African countries.
Nigeria is grateful for this applause, I would say. Okay, Achike, Chude, what's your own view on that? Would you also feel that Nigeria should be given a permanent membership at the United Nations Security Council? And probably you have another country in mind or countries in mind. Achike.
Okay, I guess his guess is as good as mine. I'm sure he'll go for Nigeria.
Definitely. But finally,
it's still open for debate.
Yeah, definitely. But finally, Mawuli, if you're looking at if we're given, but if we're not given this permanent membership, I mean, looking at the role of African Union, even on the African continent, there's been a lot of kickbacks on the fact that African Union has not necessarily been representing the needs of Africans, and there's just been more of for the leaders. So going forward, what would you say for the African Union representing Africa, and not just even on the United Nations Security Council?
Fantastic question, because I have always said that it has to start with African leadership, African interests, Africa's mobilization. So when I say that I would vote for Nigeria to be the African rep, it also means that Nigeria has a responsibility to produce strong and responsible leaders that can actually represent Africa's interests. So it's not just Nigeria for Nigeria's sake. Unfortunately, I'm sad to say, but your current leadership, I don't think, can provide that leadership. So
we have elections. We have elections next month, and hopefully things change for the better.
So it means that we as Africans have to do a better job at electing leaders that can actually move us forward. And Nigeria especially, if we can fix your leadership, I think a lot can happen on the continent. And yes, China is pursuing their interests. US is pursuing they're all pursuing their interests. It's up to Africans to actually know what we deserve and what we want and fight for it.
On that note,
it's not just about our leaders, it's also about us as citizens. It's time we start speaking out and demanding better from our leaders.
On that note, I'd like
finally,
to say,
finally, we talk about representation, and I always know that even in this conversation, we always precondition it on our ability or our leaders' ability to be better leaders or to do better. But I believe that representation in itself is a right and entitlement worth fighting for. So yes, I'm all for demanding better leadership on the continent and having more responsible and stronger leaders on the continent. But I will not precondition our representation on the UN Security Council on that, because we have a right to be represented there. And I think that is enough solid ground to get that and demand and get that.
Thank you very much, Mawuli Dake, Pan-Africanist and CEO Africa Group Consult, and also Achike Chude, Global Affairs Analyst, who joined from Lagos in Nigeria. We do appreciate your contribution and insights to the subject. Thank you.
Thank you.